Well, welcome everyone to another episode of the Min Ed Soda podcast. I am the Duffer, Kip Lincoln. I'm joined by my teammate and colleague, the Doctor, Todd Van Erp. Here we go, Todd, our first episode of October. We failed miserably and only got one in September, but maybe we'll do better this month.
Well, I think that is a good message for the school leaders and anyone else that's listening to our podcast, that I think we need to lead with grace. And I was a little disappointed that we could not connect our schedules better in September to get another episode recorded, but I know my schedule is super busy and I just have to be okay with that and know that October's a new month. I'm going to try to get a second episode recorded here in October, and we'll try to do better. That's all we can ask of ourselves, right?
Here's how we're gonna do better, Todd, is we've got like the superstar guest today that like doubles. It's like having two guests because he's got two titles, and therefore it's like doing two episodes.
Yeah. The neat thing about this, the guest that we have on today, is that he does everything. And I haven't asked this person yet, but they might even wash windows at the school too.
Well, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest for this episode of the podcast?
Well, I will do that. I'm super excited to have Jon Moore. Jon is the superintendent and K-12 principal at Ashby Public Schools. And if you don't know where Ashby is, it is kind of between Alexandria and Fergus Falls, just off I-94 in that part of the state. So Jon, he was the K-12 principal at Ashby, and then this summer he took on the additional duty of being the superintendent. And Jon is like, I don't know, 24, 25 years old. He's a young gun in the educational world. Okay, maybe not 24, 25, but Jon is a shining star, I would say, in our area of the state as far as educational leadership. So welcome, Jon. We're glad to have you on.
Hope all is
well in Ashby today.
It's always good in Ashby, and
go Arrows.
Absolutely, go Arrows. And we even have a sign when you come into town that says you're going to like it here. I mean, we try to convince you as soon as you pull into town that you're going to like it in Ashby. So that's a good thing that we remind you of that when you show up, but everyone should. And Todd, I don't know why you're buttering me up and making me sound so good. I mean, you must have really been on a stretch trying to find somebody to do this podcast with you today.
Well, I wasn't going to tell you that, but yeah, we kind of hit rock bottom, and I figured, what the heck, we're gonna get Jon Moore on. But no, Jon, really, the reason I wanted to have you on today was just talk about your experiences in education. You becoming the not only the K-12 principal, but also the superintendent. And I know that there's other people around the state that are serving in the same capacity as you. You're in a smaller school district. You are wearing multiple hats as an administrator. And I want you to talk a little bit about that. I want you to talk about some of the positives and challenges around being in a small district, and also maybe some advice for young leaders as they look to expand their leadership skills. And some people look at a smaller district and they're like, I don't want to be a part of that. But I think there's a lot of awesome opportunities that are available in small districts. So I just threw a lot at you there. And
yes.
So talk about, first I want you to talk about what was your teaching background and how did you get into administration?
So I am an elementary teacher by trade, and I know, Todd, that doesn't surprise you based on what you've seen when you've been in my building and how I dressed throughout your visits. So I taught elementary, third grade, and fifth grade. And I did that for a number of years, and then transitioned into a role of community ed director and dean of students for two different elementary schools. So I served as community ed director for 5 different communities throughout Grant County, and then served as the elementary dean of students for 2 elementary schools that were 21 miles apart. And I was also the head football coach at that time, and we paired with Ashby. So I already had a relationship with the school district, and I transitioned to be their building principal after a couple of years of being a community ed director and dean of students. And so I've been the acting K-12, or I have to say E-12. I got a lot of grief from our early childhood folks that I also service them. And so you can't say K-12, you need to say E-12. So I was the E-12 principal for the last 3 years in Ashby. And then, as you had said, I took over as superintendent. Along with that, I also picked up transportation director. And since I didn't have enough to do, I also picked up community ed director since I had that background.
Well, I'm glad that they're keeping you busy in Ashby, because you got too much talent just to be sitting around doing nothing like you were when you're the K-12, or I should say E-12 principal, right?
Yeah, exactly. E-12 principal. What I think is really happening is they're just pushing me further and further back in the office to keep me away from kids.
Right. Well, I think you have some similar experiences to what Kip has had. Kip being Kip, your first administrative experiences was in Bold, right, where you were wearing multiple hats. You were a K-12 principal. Like, what are some experiences that you have had, Kip, that might be similar to John?
Well, one of the things that he kind of talked about was like, all these things that kind of get layered on when you are either a K-12 or an E-12 principal in a small district. One is oftentimes you're the only licensed administrator. So anything that involves that needing a license, you're doing. But with that also becomes like, you get such an intimate knowledge of like so many different roles and responsibilities that sometimes it's just natural for you to do some of those things, like helping with transportation or in the kitchen, or some of those different types of things that you get to a larger district. And there's people that do those things, like there's layers. And when you get into a small district, there's just not layers. And so you just don't have people. And so then that becomes a unique opportunity, but yet also a challenge of just trying to figure out where's the time.
Well, go ahead. Finish your thought.
But I was gonna say, but with it, you get to know, like really know the community and the kids. I mean, I used to tell people all the time when I was at Bold, a parent could come in the building and I may not have always remembered what his or her name was as the parent, but I knew who their kid was. I knew which classroom they were sitting in, and I could probably tell you which desk they were in at that time, because you get such an intimate knowledge of the kids, the families, the building, and just the personal interactions you get to have because you know everyone.
Yeah.
Is that what you're finding, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I had a conversation with someone that I was trying to explain to them what it was like working in a small district. And really, you get to be such a big part of the community because you wear so many different hats that you're involved in absolutely everything. So the youngest sibling, the parent, the grandparent, because you saw them down at the diner and they stopped and had a conversation with you, or you're walking back uptown and you got stopped 3 or 4 times on the side of the road to have a conversation with someone who used to work in the district. You just get to be so embedded in the community. And as Kip was saying, you get such a strong understanding of how the school system works. If you jump right into maybe a larger school district, and again, I've only worked in small school districts, but as Kip indicated, you only have it's like tunnel vision. Like you get such a small perspective of the district, whereas in a small school district, you are involved in everything. So you get to create these great relationships with your custodial staff, your kitchen staff, because you're probably helping them at one time or another. I've driven I call it the Zamboni because I played hockey at one point in time in my life, but the floor scrubber, I've driven that. I've been in the kitchen. And as Todd, you and I have talked about, that was a terrible experience for our students that we had Hot Pockets, baked beans, and canned fruit by the end of the day because my serving sizes are significantly off from what they should be getting.
But what else did they have? I mean, they had large serving sizes, but they also had what, John? Because you were the head cook for the day.
What did they get? Probably
Yeah.
a stomach ache.
You were not following the smart snack guidelines. I guarantee you
I
that.
wasn't. I had
But
I had a teacher that says big snacks, big slacks, and I live that every day.
but the kids also got cookies that day which were not
They
on the menu.
weren't on the
correct?
menu. I did sneak into the freezer and bake about 150 cookies and started dishing those out.
Yeah.
I made 160. They got 150. The other 10 was a principal tax.
Well, I look at it as you were making sure that they were safe for the students to eat.
That's our role as administrators, is to make sure that students are safe. And so if I had to eat 10 cookies to do that, I was going to do it for our kids.
That's what you do. You're a giver.
Yeah, but in reality, being in a small school is great. I mean, you really get to know all the different capacities of your employees that work for you. And when they see you helping them every single day, it creates a pretty strong relationship. Sorry, I got I'm connected like 3 different ways when I get phone calls in my office. It rings to my office phone, on my computer, and my cell phone all at the same time. There's literally nowhere you can hide. Nowhere. Even in the kitchen, they tend to find you.
That's part of the multiple hats, right? Though, because you got everybody kind of needing you right now.
Right.
Well, you touched on
so
it.
I go ahead.
I was gonna say you touched on a couple of things that would really like piqued my interest just because of my experience. So like I had that very small, smaller school, because even Bold is significantly larger than Ashby. But I went from Bold to Eden Prairie, and it was such a monstrous jump. I went from a building of 300 kids from 3 communities and their surrounding areas to a building of 1,000 that were all within about 2 miles of each other. Like the whole town of Bird Island, everybody that's considered a resident of Bird Island would have fit inside the elementary school in Eden Prairie. And I went from functioning like at Bold, where, like I said, I knew every kid, I knew their parents, I could tell you where they were sitting, and having this intimate knowledge, to this building where you only knew a very, very, very tiny fraction of the community. There wasn't a huge expectation from families that you had an intimate knowledge of their family and their background. It was almost like you'd meet some of the families sometimes and they go, "Well, I hope you don't know my child." Like it was such a different different view, and that's not to say that they didn't want a good relationship between you and their student, but early on when I first got there, that was like some of the parents' comments was literally like, "I hope you don't know my child yet." And it was just such a different mentality of what the principal is and does. In fact, I tell people I felt I was functioning more like Bold superintendent when I was Eden Prairie's principal. And I don't know if that like has any kind of rings truth to what your experiences are. Or...
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in and say, Kip, what as you have added that layer of superintendent work, John, like how has that changed your work so far this year? Like you became the superintendent on July 1st. How has that changed your work and your experiences within the building as compared to the previous 3 years when you were the K-12 principal?
E12.
Sorry.
Thanks, Kip.
Sorry.
I appreciate that. I still make the mistake, so it's okay. I forgive you. I was fortunate enough that the board was pretty supportive. And when I took over the role of superintendent, I said, listen, I can't do this and operate on my own because our previous superintendent, the previous 2 were all half-time. And so we moved from a 1.5 admin positions to a full-time 2. So I have a full-time assistant principal. And so the scope of my work changed in that I am no longer dealing with the majority of the student discipline issues. And so I get to do more of the planning and working with teachers and actually getting into classrooms and helping out with the instructional pieces instead of just dealing with all the discipline. And then obviously there's all the financial components that go along with it. We passed a building referendum August 10th. So not a month after I took over as superintendent, we started shifting gears and we're planning for a building construction project. So I'm very involved in that. I have, I'm always working on something with we have a call with Moody's today. So that's basically a credit score, or a bond score for school districts. So I end up in my office a lot more than I used to. I loved walking around the building, interacting with kids, getting involved in what was happening in the building. And I found myself, I call it trapped. I'm not a very good desk jockey, but I find myself in my office more dealing with more paperwork, just making sure that the building is operating the way it's supposed to, working with my business manager. So I still feel very involved. It's just a different involved. I'm not as involved with student issues, which was a transition for me because I really like working with kids. I really liked having that intimate knowledge of what's going on in their home life and trying to find some resources for them so that they can be more successful. And now I'm delegating more of those responsibilities and just kind of explaining to the people involved what my expectations are, and trying to lead them to the appropriate people to get kids those help.
Well, one thing though that I think I would like to point out, and this is a strategy Todd and I try to work with principals and people that are just principals, is one of the things that you've been able to do by hiring a full-time assistant principal is you've now gotten to take control of your calendar, right? You mentioned I don't deal with as many of the student discipline things. Well, those tend to be the things that throw your calendar off when you're starting to deal with the emergency of, now you actually can take control of your calendar and say, you know what, I'm going to dedicate this time to being in that high school classroom or that high school event, or I'm going to be in the kindergarten event and concert today, knowing that you're not going to get pulled out for an emergency. And that's actually one of the things that Todd and I try to work with people that are just in the traditional principal's role, is have people to do some of those things so that you can take control of your calendar and not be constantly putting out fires.
Right. And that's a transition for us too, with her, our new assistant principal being new to the district, and I have all the working knowledge of how everything works. We're still trying to figure out our roles and responsibilities. So that's like my dream, is that we'll eventually get to that point where I can set up a calendar and not get 15 people walking through the door asking questions, wondering whether they should come to me or a new assistant principal. So we're kind of redesigning how our school operates, just because we haven't been in this position for a long time. And so that's been a challenge in just trying to learn my new role, train in a new administrator, and just reshape how we operate as a school district.
It's interesting you bring that up, Kip, because in a conversation that I had with John, that must have been in August, was that I think it might have been last spring even, you talked about that was going to be one of the challenges of the upcoming year, was to figure out roles, responsibilities, John having that institutional knowledge of how things have run and they've been pretty successful, and then how does he hand off those responsibilities to others within the organization as he takes on the new role within the school district. So John, one question that I had for you is, as you have moved through the teaching aspect of education, being a principal and now superintendent and principal, what kind of advice would you have for educators that might be thinking about making that next step or that move into administrative leadership? Maybe some things to do, some things maybe to avoid. What advice would you have?
I liked the transition that I made, going from a teacher to that dean of students / community ed role. For me, the community ed piece was an amazing opportunity to look at all the different stakeholders that are involved in your school district. When you're looking at just being a building principal, you're focused on just the students that are in the building and the families that are there. When you're a community ed director, which I think pairs really well with superintendent, you're looking at birth through death. Basically, those are your stakeholders. You're looking at absolutely everybody. And so having that opportunity of being a dean of students, working with kids, being an educator, and having a stronger, I'm not going to say strong because I mean, you can always be stronger, but a strong understanding of how education works within the building walls. And then having, okay, this community ed piece where you're working with early childhood and basically at birth all the way through people at, the 55 and alive driving courses. You have so many more people involved in your school district than you think. And then I looked at even this transition to superintendent now and working with the building referendum. I was communicating information to people who never step into our building at all and trying to convince them that our additions are a good thing to have. And so another piece that I look at is how can I get all of those people involved in the school? So I kind of went on a detour there. I call it a bird walk. I kind of detoured from the conversation, but when you get into administration, I think you really have to think about what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? If you are really focused on increasing student achievement and you want to have a positive effect on the students in that building, a principal is a great role for you because that's what you get to focus on. I compared it a lot to coaching. Instead of working with kids, you're working with teachers. You're trying to do the same thing. You're motivating them to perform their very best, and you're analyzing results and you're showing it to them and saying, hey, if we do this, this, and this, we can just continue to grow and improve. And so I would compare being a coach and a principal. They're kind of like the same thing. I mean, you're just changing your scope of who you're working with. And then again, you get to work with every kid. And I always liked that as an educator. I might've been an elementary teacher, but I was a high school varsity coach. And then I helped out in other capacities with some youth stuff. And then when I stepped into the community ed and dean of students role, I got to work with absolutely everybody. And I love that. I loved working with all the different age groups. And that was the same thing for being an E12 principal. Is 1 minute I could be sitting on the floor reading the book with no pictures. And then 30 minutes later, I'm working with a senior who's having problems trying to they can't graduate because they don't have enough credits, and we're trying to come up with a game plan. So for me, I don't know if that's an ADD thing, but I'm kind of all over the place. I like to help as many people as possible. And now that I've transitioned into superintendent, I just get to take one more step and looking at our entire community and how can we improve things? How can we use a school as a way to improve our entire community?
And what I just heard there, John, was like a thing of beauty of like, I got to sample this portion of what a superintendent does in this role. And I got to sample a little bit of what they do in this role as community ed. And so like, it's like you took all of your experiences now and you got to like sample good portions. Cause even like the school finance is a huge deal.
Yeah.
But being a community ed director, you're dealing with its own entity, its own fund within the school finance system, that it's its own coffer. And so you got to like sample like all kinds of different parts of being a superintendent along the way. And now you kind of just smush them all together and have it as your overall job title.
Right.
I think that's actually a technical term, smush.
Smush it all together.
Yeah. Well, John, before we wrap things up here today, usually I like to do some rapid fire questions. And I don't know if I told you about this or not, but so hopefully you got your thinking cap on, and I'm going to fire a few questions at you, and you don't have to elaborate on them if you don't want to, but
I just want to get prepared for this. I apologize. Okay. I'm ready.
Oh,
nice. On. I'm good.
This is the Jon Moore I know. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, you get to see the crazy wig that John's. One time I stopped in to see John at school, and he was dressed up as the elf on the shelf, right?
Mr. Moore on the shelf.
Yeah. Oh my God. It was, he comes walking on. I was like, oh.
And you had paid, was it you that you were like sitting on the roof one morning when the kids came to school? Did you do that one, or was it somebody else?
I have been on the roof before, but that was somebody else that did.
Now, when you're the elf on the shelf, though, that's the one when you got to do it, right? Like, so like you're seated up on the school with your legs crossed and just kind of greeting the kids as they come in as the elf on the shelf.
Yep. I was on our cafeteria table, so I laid on there. People, I really got confused. They just couldn't tell if I was trying to be an elf or just a poorly dressed Santa Claus, because I look more like Santa and less like an elf.
It was hilarious. I can attest. It was awesome. Okay, here's your first question. What chore do you absolutely hate doing?
At home or at school?
Either one.
Laundry.
Okay. Your second question is, if you could learn to do anything, what would it be?
Play guitar.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. Third question is, which celebrity do you get mistaken for?
Kevin James.
You say it. I can see it. I got it. Yes.
I had a parent come up to me and they're like, "Hey, we were watching Here Comes the Boom," and my son just went off and goes, "Holy cow, that's Mr. Moore." I agree that is
Well,
probably something that I would try to do.
when I first got to Eden Prairie, I had a little buzz cut and just a goatee, and I had bigger rimmed glasses, like the thick square ones. And I overheard a conversation with a parent as they were saying, like, "Okay, which one's the principal? The one that looks like Drew Carey over there." I was like, "Oh my gosh, I do." I never saw it until I heard the parent say it, but I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm like Drew Carey."
I can see both of those. Oh my gosh. Okay, next question, John. What was the first thing you bought with your own money?
Probably some form of chocolate bar.
Oh,
Like, are we talking like young?
it'd be anything. Like, first thing you bought with your own money.
Probably a snack.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking, when I read that question, I'm thinking to myself, as a kid, we would go to Langer's Grocery in Bluffton, and we would buy these long strips of bubble gum, and I thought those were so cool.
Yeah.
So, and your last question here, John, is, what is your favorite form of exercise?
Oh, I used to run the weight room, so I used to love working out. Used to is the key term there. So now, if any physical activity, I really enjoy pheasant hunting, and so if I can get out with my dog and go for a couple miles, I love doing that. But otherwise, I used to enjoy powerlifting quite a bit.
Wow. Well, you can still get back to it.
I know it's a goal.
You could probably dominate in the senior division.
I'm not there yet.
Well, you need to work.
I got to work on it.
You got to work up to it. So when you get to the senior division, you totally are ready to dominate. So
yeah.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for answering those questions. I know some of those are really hard hitting type of questions. So I appreciate you being open to answering those. And I'm going to toss it back to Kip here. Kip, what's one nugget of info that you learned about today from John?
Well, yeah, I just throughout the whole thing, I just kept reflecting on that sometimes we could see like the negative side of like a small district, and just that, like, oh, he's got to do everything. He's got to do everything. But I want to flip it to like just the opportunities that were there, of like, as he explained all his different things, like he had such an intimate knowledge of so many different parts and roles of school leadership through his experience, because he was in a small district. Those are things that you don't get if you're a teacher in the metro area at a large school, or a dean of students at a large school. You kind of get very narrow lanes in terms of your responsibilities. And so I just so impressed with people that are willing to stay in our small schools because they see the value and understand how great it is and how wonderful it is, and just the amount of knowledge and different opportunities they have to serve their community in so many different ways. It's just super powerful to me.
I just kept thinking, Kip, right along those lines too, exactly what you just said. And I just think that leaders in small schools are kind of like the Swiss Army knife of education. They know about everything, and they can handle any situation, whether it's in regards to school finance, community ed, usually athletic directing, instructional leadership, having a full understanding of I talked about school finance, but just like they have this total understanding of the whole system where exactly what you said, Kip. I think in larger schools, sometimes school leaders don't get the opportunities to learn all those different facets of the schools. So,
And not only are they the Swiss Army knife, they're the only Swiss Army knife, right? Like there's nobody, they're the only one there.
Yeah. So you have to be. So Jon, thank you so much for being with us today. I know like our time has flown by, and I so appreciate you taking time out of your day to hang out with us for a little while and chat a little bit about being in a small school and about your trip through your administrative career so far. So thanks, Jon.
Absolutely. I'm glad I could do it. And I apologize you couldn't find somebody more interesting. Plan C.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking. I do need to get up to Ashby because I know Jon's got some really neat stuff that's going on there, which we didn't necessarily touch on in this episode, but Jon and I got to line up some time so I can get back up there and see him in person.
You're free to come at any time.
Okay. That sounds great. I'll take you up on that.
Yeah, good.
Thank you everyone for hanging around. We're approaching a half hour, I think, in terms of our amount of time. So thank you for sticking with us here on the Min Ed Soda podcast. You can find Todd and I on Twitter with the hashtag Min, MINN, capital ED, Soda, SOTA. So the hashtag Min Ed Soda podcast. He's at Principal Learner. I'm at Kip Link, and you can reach us and we will maybe respond to you if you give us something good to chew on. I know a couple episodes ago, we had one of Todd's former students give a shout out at us, and it was very interesting. Mm-hmm. So please do reach out. We'd love if you got ideas for guests or topics, we'd gladly take those as well. Any final goodbyes, Todd?
Also, we're found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and a whole list of other places. So just check us out and spread the word. We're always looking for followers.
Hit subscribe or follow, and then you don't even have to wait for a new one to drop and come back and check. It'll just be on your phone when you're ready for it.
Yep. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care.